French Europe minister has questioned whether an additional delay to the Brexit process was justified. This after the British Parliament rejected the government's accelerated timetable to approve a deal negotiated with the European Union. Lawmakers in Westminster backed the withdrawal agreement itself, but refused Prime Minister Boris Johnson's plan to speed up the process. Meanwhile, European Council President Donald Tusk says Prime Minister Boris Johnson's decision to put the Brexit deal on hold, he would recommend that the other 27 member states of the EU approve a delay of Britain's departure date. Mr. Tusk said in a tweet, I quote now, following PM Boris Johnson's decision to pause the process of ratification of the withdrawal agreement, and in order to avoid a no-deal Brexit, I will recommend the EU 27 accept the UK's request for an extension. For this, I'll propose a written procedure. Irish Prime Minister Leo Varadkar said he would await further developments from London and Brussels about a possible extension to Brexit. And as the clock ticks down to the deadline for Britain's departure, Brexit is hanging in the balance as a divided Parliament debates when, how, and even whether it should happen. Let's get the views of Global Affairs Analyst Andrew McLEOD, who will give us his take on this developing story and the happenings in Britain. Thank you very much for joining us at this time. So what do you make of the happenings in the British Parliament? They agreed to the deal, but didn't agree with the plan of Mr. Johnson to expedite how Britain would leave. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, let's clarify just slightly. They didn't agree on the plan. They agreed to debate the plan. So what they passed in Parliament yesterday was what's called the second reading. That is, permission to look at the legislation even further. The second component that Boris Johnson lost was the timetable, and what Boris was proposing was to review 400 odd pages of legislation in only 2 days. And that 400 pages of legislation would be the most significant constitutional and legal change to the United Kingdom in a generation. So it's quite understandable that MPs would say, yes, we're quite happy to debate this bill, step one, but we don't want only 2 days to debate it, step two. And to an extent, the October 31 deadline is somewhat artificial. And the politicians would argue that to fulfill their role properly, we need more time to look at 400 pages. And whether that's 1 week, 2 weeks, 5 weeks, and given that the departure of the EU will be a multi-generational decision, does it really matter if you're taking 1 or 2 more weeks to do it?
All right, so if I get it correctly, does it sound like a reasonable move on the part of Parliament? Now, after all, like you said, 400 pages, how will they reasonably debate that within 2 days?
That's exactly right. When you take the pro or anti-Brexit out of it and just ask yourself, is it reasonable for Parliament to only have 2 days to debate 400 pages of the most significant legal and constitutional change to the United Kingdom in a generation? You very quickly go, no, that's actually not reasonable. Let's make it a little bit longer, because we know in legislation, in all sorts of areas of law, there can be errors of drafting that can make a significant difference. And believe me, tax attorneys will be going through this legislation line by line very closely to try and find the best way of avoiding tax.
Imagine now the frustration of the EU. What do you make of that?
Look, I can understand the EU being incredibly frustrated at this. At the end of the day, this was not the EU's decision. It was the UK's decision to leave the EU. And the UK has proved itself over the last 3 years to be thoroughly unprepared for the departure and thoroughly unprepared for the debate. So if I was the EU, I'd be slapping my forehead and I'd be thinking, what are these people doing? And there will be some people within the EU that are still arguing, don't give them an extension on October 31, let's just be rid of them.
So what happens now?
So it's still not entirely sure. The assumption is that the European Union will allow an extension beyond October 31 to allow the Parliament time to debate the legislation. But to confuse matters, Boris Johnson has now put the legislation on hold and has said, well, what I'd prefer, if I can't debate it in only 2 days, what I want to have is a general election. But calling a general election is in the position of Parliament to decide, not the Prime Minister to decide. So we're not really sure. So very much like the last 3 years, is it possible that we could leave without a deal on October 31? Yes. Is it possible that Parliament might revoke? Yes, but highly unlikely. Is it possible that we might have a second referendum? Possibly, but not yet probable. Is it possible that we get an extension and debate this for the next couple of months? Yes, that's most likely. In other words, nothing has changed. We still don't know what's going to happen.
And of these propositions that you just enumerated, which would be the worst for Britain? Do I reckon that it would be living without a deal, or will there be something worse?
No, I think leaving without a deal is the worst option for Britain. The great tragedy is there are some politicians and some in civil society in the UK that still believe Britain can go back to the good old days and regain their colonies and regain their empire. You know, Nigeria give up its independence and become a colony again. Australia give up its independence and become a colony again. And everyone will bow down at the feet of Her Majesty the Queen. But we all know that's not true. So there's that small element that actually think a no-deal Brexit is the best outcome. I think they're wrong. I think a no-deal Brexit is the worst outcome. I think the best likely outcome now is an extension and then a leave with a deal. I still think that will harm Britain's economy over the long term. I think there'll be a lot of grandchildren that will be very angry at their grandparents as the grandchildren realise they no longer have freedom of movement in Europe. They no longer have the right to live and work in France or Germany or the Czech Republic or go to study there. People will be losing their healthcare benefits. Like right now, UK people can travel to Europe and they lose their healthcare. People will realise how bad that is the first time they break their leg in a ski resort in France.
But the discourse around Brexit, hasn't it, mainly overlapped every other discussion that affects the average British in the country and elsewhere? Has the population indeed been well served from your observation with this three-year-old debate?
No, I think the population's been very poorly served. There's an old saying in communications, which is you never win a logical argument with emotion or an emotional argument with logic. And generally speaking, most of the people who support Brexit do it from an emotional perspective. I just want Britain to rule Britain. I'm not saying that's bad, I'm just saying it's emotional. And most of the people that vote Remain are doing it from a logical perspective. We'll lose this trade, lose that trade, etc. So you actually have, over the entire 3 years, one group arguing largely emotionally, one group arguing largely logically, and they're never matching, which means the British population have been just given soundbite after soundbite, but not actually steered through the difficulty of this debate over the last 3 years. So I think most British people are just as confused about Brexit as they were 3 years ago. So I think both the pro-Brexit and pro-Remain people have very, very poorly served the British people.
Global Affairs Analyst Andrew McLEOD, thank you very much for your contributions.
Thank you.
You're watching The World Now on TVC News. Coming up,